Good morning, everyone. We'll be getting started very soon. In the meantime, let me take the opportunity to say thanks for joining us. Remember, if you are not speaking, please make sure you keep your mic on mute so that we avoid feedback and background noise that makes it difficult to hear people who are speaking. My name is Christine. I'm the Director of Security and Privacy Policy at the Internet Society, and I'm going to be the moderator today. But to start us off, I'd like to hand over to David Vorst to give us a little introduction. David, over to you.
Hi, everybody. My name is David Vorst, and I'm the Executive Director of the Washington, D.C. chapter of the Internet Society, and I'm very thrilled to be participating in this event today and to have helped make it happen. This is a unique opportunity to bring ISOC staff, ISOC chapters, and our global community together for an important discussion that will bring different stakeholder perspectives to the table in order to advance a way forward on such an important issue that's vital to trust in the internet. I want to thank everybody from the ISOC policy team, especially Christine and Konstantinos and York, and everybody else that worked to make this happen, and our distinguished panel as well.
Thank you very much, David. And it really is thanks to David that this all came about. It really was his initiative. We've got a lot to cover today, so why don't we get started? First of all, a reminder to everyone that the Internet Society Action Plan for 2016 covers two areas of focus. One is, and very importantly for our discussion today, is promoting and restoring trust in the internet. Before I continue, though, let me advise everyone that we will be recording the event so that others can watch it later that were unavailable to attend. I'd also like to remind everyone that we have a web page on our website with a lot of resources about encryption, and I'm hoping that my colleague Dan will put the link in the chat while we get started. We have a really great panel of experts today from different places and different perspectives who are going to help us kick off the conversation. Just before I introduce them, let me give you a very quick outline of how we're going to do the dialogue today. So I'm going to introduce them very quickly, and then I've given them each a maximum of 5 minutes to share their perspective, to sort of get us into the discussion. And then the plan is, we've put together some questions. So we'll start off with some question and answers that we've put together. And we've been collecting questions from you. Oh, could somebody mute the mic? And we'll be starting off with those and inviting all of you online to ask your questions and share your views. Okay, so with that, let me introduce our very distinguished panel. First of all, we have Amitabh Singhal, and he's from India, and you might like to know that he helped with the privatization of ISP business in India, he says, way back in the late 90s. And he also says he's been basking in all that glory ever since. I should tell you that I did try to encourage our panelists to give a bit of a funny introduction. We have Amie Stepanovitch, and she is the US Policy Manager and Global Policy Counsel at Access Now. She's working on the intersection of human rights and technology and trying to incorporate nerdy pop culture references and Hamilton lyrics into blog posts and press releases. We have also Dr. Radsch, who works at the Nexus of Media, Technology and Rights, and she's the Advocacy Director at the Committee to Protect Journalists and author of the forthcoming book, Cyber Activism and Citizen Journalism in Egypt, Digital Dissonance and Political Change. Make sure you look out for that book. We also have Mr. Kimmo Ulkuniemi. He's the Assistant Director for Cyber Strategy and Outreach in INTERPOL Global Complex for Innovation. He has 24 years experience in law enforcement and several years experience in cybercrime investigation. He is Interpol delegate in ICANN Governmental Advisory Committee, and he's been active in international police cooperation. I'd like to point out that Kimmo will be speaking in his personal capacity today in our dialogue. And last but not least, we have Olaf Kolkman, and he's the Chief Internet Technology Officer of the Internet Society. He's a generalist with a strong interest in internet security and its technical foundation. He's also been actively involved with internet technologies since his astronomy studies during the early 90s. So with that very quick introduction, I'll also say hello and welcome to everyone. As Konstantinos has put in the chat, please post your questions or comments there so we can keep track of them as the day, as the event progresses. So at this point, I'd like to turn to Olaf to share his perspective with us.
And in order to do that, I first need to unmute. So, encryption is this is a very broad topic. We all sort of know the history, the early debates, but I want to sort of kick off with where we are now. In the past few years, the Snowden revelation have put something in motion. It has put in motion that people are much more cognizant about the fact that traffic that traverses the internet might be listened to. And there has been a reaction by the general public and by technologists to restore trust by turning on encryption, which in fact prevents the ability to eavesdrop on traffic that passes over the internet. That is visible. There is, if you look at the curves of deployment of the encryption protocols on the internet, you see rises of multiple tens of percents. Depending on the application, even up to 80% of traffic being encrypted. That is visible and and noticeable and has some effects on the way that people use the internet and look at the internet for law enforcement needs and for traffic engineering. This is not to say that encryption is a bad thing. In fact, encryption is one of the only mechanisms to prevent sniffing into, looking into traffic. And Internet Society has made a statement a couple of years ago that encryption should be the norm on the internet. Encryption should be the norm. Where does that lead us? I think over the last year, we've seen that ultimately leads us to a place where law enforcement has asked for backdoors and front doors, where the technical and academic community has said that will not work. I think there is a fair amount of consensus around cryptographic backdoors not working, not implementable on both technological as well as managerial and policy based. So where does that lead us? That leads that the entities that need to look into our traffic or want to look into our traffic will end up at the endpoints, at the devices. And the recent Apple FBI case was an example of that, where law enforcement, for all reasons that we probably understand, wanted to have access to the data on that phone to understand what communication took place. That is an example of the approach that you see that when you need access, that access can only be gotten in the endpoints of the communication or at the intermediary points of the communication. And now the question is, I think the question is, who is responsible for maintaining on these devices? And I think that there is I have a thesis that responsibility for maintaining the best security on our devices is with the industry. That's my thesis. The industry will make a constant trade-off between the usability that they can implement at a reasonable price and the needs of the customer base. So, and I think that will end up in an equilibrium that still allows for law enforcement to do their work, not directly by getting access through, say, the vendors, perhaps not, but the security of our devices is not perfect. The security of our communication is not perfect. So there will continue to be ways to get access to data, not in all cases. And I think that is where we currently are with the whole debate. And what type of principles do we need in order to go forward? So those are my open questions at the moment. And with that, I'm going to hand over the token back to Christine.
Thank you very much, Olaf. That was really a very good introduction and a good start to the conversation. I'd now like to hand over to Kimmo, and as a reminder to everyone, even though he is from INTERPOL, he's speaking in his personal capacity. Kimmo, are you able to join us now?
Yes, thank you, Christine, and thank you very much. And thank you, Dan and Konstantinos, for inviting me to join this discussion and giving opportunity to contribute this very important and interesting topic. First of all, I think it would be important to make a difference between law enforcement and intelligence agencies. Often when we talk about encryption and legal interception and interception in general, people tend to mix two things like law enforcement and intelligence agencies. In general, law enforcement agencies, when they investigate crimes, they are having court order for the legal interception or confiscating and decrypting media what they have. So that's the biggest difference. And in intelligence agencies, they are working with national security issues, and of course, there's a different legislation for that. Of course, well, in INTERPOL we have 190 member countries, and 190 countries, it means that there's a lot of different kind of a legislation for the law enforcement, and they have different challenges in different countries when it comes to terrorism or preventing crimes, and therefore needs might be also different. I strongly believe in a strong encryption. And in fact, what law enforcement is doing at the moment, when we are communicating to each other, we are using strong encryption for that. We have to use strong encryption for communication. And I believe that public in general, they should be also using encryption in their communication when it comes to whether it's banking or communicating to each other. But then the question, of course, should be asked if law enforcement should have a means to decrypt this communication. Often the challenge for law enforcement needs is that, well, we have the information static. So the information is located either in mobile device or computer, and we might have more time, but still it doesn't mean that we would have means to decrypt the media. And for that purpose, law enforcement, we have basically two options. We can use the way of trying to find a vulnerability in that encryption, which means that it's time consuming. It's usually it takes also lots of resources, financial resources, or we could discuss with civil society, legislators, and industry to find a better solution. Better solution doesn't necessarily mean that there should be a backdoor for law enforcement to decrypt the information. Instead of that, there could be other kind of solutions. And I know that in earlier discussions, for example, blockchain was mentioned to be one of that kind of a technology that could provide a solution for storing keys for governments. Then, of course, for the encryption and law enforcement, one of the big questions is what are the rights and obligations for the suspect in the investigation? Should they provide access to data they have? And again, in our member countries, it depends. Some of the member countries, they have that in legislation. Some of them, they don't have. And I think it's a question of, first of all, the culture and also the interpretation of the privacy. Knowing that privacy is understood differently in different parts of the world. And privacy in some parts of the world might mean that government and law enforcement, they have access to information, and they are in fact protecting the information for citizens. So I don't have so much answer for law enforcement. I have more questions, and I'm looking forward to have this discussion with you.
Thank you, Kimmo. It was really very refreshing to hear your personal perspective, but also to hear what is happening in the community that you work with on a daily basis. At this point, I'm going to turn to Courtney. Are you there, Courtney?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me? Okay. So thank you so much. I think that one of the challenges in this debate around internet privacy, trust, encryption, maybe thank you. So I think one of the challenges in this debate is that it's so focused on the questions around law enforcement and the questions specifically arising out of anti-terrorism, the anti-terrorism, movement, and the focus on addressing these, these issues coming out of San Bernardino, Paris, Brussels, elsewhere. But I think that what is forgotten is that strong encryption is so important that it's actually protected under international law. Encryption and anonymity, both separately and together, were identified by the Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression and Belief, David Kay, as critical to enacting the rights to freedom of expression and the freedom to impart information and to receive information. He said that it creates a zone of privacy to protect opinion and belief. And it helps, encryption can help people circumvent censorship. It can help them gain access to information, to communicate as a way to develop their beliefs and to express themselves. It can shield them from harassment and give them the ability to search the web for information that, in order to develop these ideas and communicate securely. The The issue that we are focused on at the Committee to Protect Journalists is obviously journalists. And I think that this is really important because the fact is that what happens to undermining encryption or the right to encryption in one country is going to have broad ramifications. So I just want to put some actual, names and stories to why encryption matters. Last year in Turkey, an Iraqi journalist for Vice News was arrested along with two of his colleagues. His colleagues were pretty quickly released, but he was held for over 100 days, in part because he had encrypted information on his computer. And they said he was using military-grade encryption. But that term, of course, refers to the technologies that are, commonly used in cell phones or smartphones, online banking, etc. So, there's this equation of journalism and some of the tools of journalism with terrorism in some of these cases. The journalist collective known as the Zone 9 bloggers were jailed and prosecuted in Ethiopia in part because they received email encryption training. So simply getting training on how to use encryption what led to, in part, their jailing. But meanwhile, the Ethiopian government is suspected of conducting widespread surveillance both inside the country and of hacking computers of journalists and media outlets working outside of Ethiopia, but focused on communicating with Ethiopians. So it's important that no matter where these Ethiopian journalists are based, that they're able to use encryption to protect themselves from government hacking. Meanwhile, in Colombia, there have been reports that the government is spying on journalists. This is something that was done in the past, and these reports have resurfaced. And then, of course, this gives rise to questions around legislation, not only around encryption, but then around surveillance. Obviously, the vast expansion of surveillance by the state has severe implications for journalists and anyone who's interested in communicating securely. So what we've seen is in Pakistan, for example, the Telecommunications Authority is requiring prior approval for using encryption. In Cuba, they require regulatory authorization. But the fact is that these technologies allow journalists to communicate confidentially with sources that they could not safely meet. It allows them to browse the web and get information that they need and research without leaving digital traces. And it allows them to publish anonymously if necessary. And this end-to-end encryption, which is, I think, what we're mainly talking about, also provides the ability of others to resist the legal and extra-legal coercion of governments in the countries where they do business of requiring or asking for access to that data. I think that one of the key reasons, and much of this applies not to just journalists, but also to activists, of course, but the issue of source protection is critical. Sources in journalism need to be assured of privacy before agreeing to talk. We have already seen how metadata can be used to reconstruct a journalist's potential communication with sources. So it's ever more important that we protect the communication itself. Encryption mitigates the threat of eavesdropping and it can remove it altogether and protect from government snooping, which is really important for journalism, again, because they depend on this communication with sources and the ability to get information securely. And the problem is that we're seeing across the world in democratic countries as well, that governments are seeking to undermine both the secure communications that journalists rely on, as well as proposals to ban some of these technologies. So we know, for example, the UK's intelligence agency, GCHQ, intercepted and saved communications between reporters and editors at some of the largest news outlets in the world. So if those communications are encrypted, they will have more limited value to the government. Meanwhile, the Prime Minister, David Cameron, proposed banning secure messaging platforms in the UK. And a lot of this is being done under the guise of the fight against terrorism or violent extremism. So again, in the UK, the Terrorism Act and the Regulation of Investigatory Powers Act, known as REPA, have been used to get around these journalistic protections, and the British government has even classified journalists as threats to national security and routinely located them between terrorists and criminal hackers in its threat indices. And we see the same thing around the world, where acts of journalism are being equated with terrorism. The reason, therefore, that encryption is so important is that it enables journalists to continue to have some level of trust with their sources, that they can protect them. And just to wrap up, I want to just briefly mention a few things that can be done and some of the things that we're doing at CPJ. First of all, you can use anonymizing browsers such as Tor in order to browse web traffic. This can hide, for example, if you're looking up contact information for a source or you're doing an investigation into a story, you don't necessarily want to tip off the authorities into what you're investigating. So using an anonymizing browser can be helpful. Similarly, there are projects like Project Galileo with Cloudflare, which protects against network attacks for smaller news outlets and provides the service for free. We're also using Secure Drop, which is an encrypted system that enables people to submit information securely, and there's no way that anyone can know who submitted that or be able to trace back. And ultimately, the goal is to get to the security level by default. So we're also working with news organizations and internet platforms that provide news to default their systems to HTTPS and to enact other encryption and default security measures so that journalists and others don't have to be as proactive or think so much about, what do I need to turn on here, et cetera. When we default to secure communications, everybody is more safe. Thank you.
Thank you, Courtney. Wow, you really covered a lot of ground there. I mean, apart from giving the perspective for journalists, you also raised a number of issues for us to discuss later. I mean, what are the implications in different countries simply for using or learning about encryption, the implications of having metadata exposed, and also thank you for mentioning David Kay's report and his opinion on encryption and anonymity. Having sort of done a quick tour de table of the world, thanks to Courtney, we're now going to take a deep dive into India with Amitabh. Thank you, Amitabh. Oh, Amitabh, you have to unmute first.
Audible now?
Yes, thanks.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Christine, and thank you, Courtney, for giving me the cue. Okay, so let me take you through the landscape as far as encryption is concerned in our part of the world, and why is encryption very, very important. I think one of the facts is that India has the second largest internet user base, counting about 460 million internet users. So obviously, it's a very, very important topic in terms of discussion on encryption and, of course, online privacy and trust issues. And I think the kind of mindshare that this subject needs to command is not yet there. However, I think I must thank Internet Society, Dan and Christine, for bringing me here to be able to share our perspective as to what is happening in India, and at the same time learn from all the other participants and take the matter from here. Okay, so in India, what happens is that internet services are generally regulated by a license that the government of India provides. And the license conditions actually put the responsibility on the licensees to ensure protection of privacy of communication and also to ensure that unauthorized interception of messages does not take place. However, at the same time, the internet license as they were created in 1998, and the situation continued till 2013, was that the internet service providers in India were forbidden to use encryption beyond 40-bit. So a very weak encryption system was allowed to be used as far as the licenses are concerned. And at the same time, the licenses were asked to provide key pairs as escrow in case the authorities or the agencies needed to look into the communication. However, in 2013, the license conditions changed a bit, and they do not now talk about 40-bit limitation. However, what it does say is that the licensee shall not employ bulk encryption equipment in its network. So this is a very generalized limitation on the use of encryption by the internet licenses and the internet service providers. However, there's concurrent legislation available in terms of a legislation which is called the Indian Information Technology Act of 2000, amended in 2008, where it basically okay, just a second. Okay, it basically prescribes for the body corporates to maintain reasonable security practices and procedures designed to protect such information from unauthorized access. At the same time, we had, while there was a limitation from the internet service providers' point of view, we had sector regulators like the banking regulator and the securities market regulator who had their own set of regulations which called for usage of higher bits of encryption in their specific sector networks. So if it was the banking industry, they were allowed to use higher encryption than 40 bits, or if it was the securities market or the financial markets, they were allowed to use higher bits of encryption. Now, having laid down the limitations on the use of encryption through the internet service provider's license, and also the requirement for providing escrow keys at that point of time, the ISP telecom licenses have also been asked, they are also asked to provide requisite interception and monitoring facilities and equipment. So it is incumbent upon the service providers to provide access to the law enforcement agencies, to connect to the network and provide access to the information which may be required by the LEAs and intelligence agencies. And it says that the government may direct any agency to intercept, monitor, or decrypt any information generated, transmitted, or received, or stored in any computer resource. However, while doing that, the subordinate legislation to the Information Technology Act also lays down certain procedures and safeguards and rules, which basically puts the onus on the agencies at the central level and at the state level to have authorization in writing, where they would give a reason and they would seek the permission to intercept particular information that they need to snoop on in terms of the particular person that they want to target, the particular communication that they want to target, and the name of the officer who will actually do the interception. So to that extent, certain safeguards have been prescribed at the same time, whereas broadly the landscape is that the government has prescribed upon the service providers to provide information as and when required. And there are certain categories under which these authorizations are provided. Basically, some of these are in terms of when it is required to investigate some cognizable offenses or in the interest of national security, and 2 or 3 other such reasons under which such authorization to intercept can be provided. The Information Technology Act of 2008 actually also has a clause which said that the modes or methods of encryption would be prescribed by the central government. Now, this was an important piece of legislation which has not been put into practice yet. And to cut these long story short about what happened from 2008 onwards, last year in 2015, the government of India tried to, actually floated a draft consultation paper, or legislation on encryption policy. Once the draft paper was put out in the public, the reaction was pretty strong, and I think all the stakeholders got together in terms of voicing their dissent to the draft encryption policy, national encryption policy, and the government had to retreat. And since then, we haven't yet heard about any other move to create a better legislation in terms of having a national policy for encryption. So that is where we stand in terms of encryption. So this is the legislative canvas that we have. We have the legal canvas in terms of use of or the limitation on the use of encryption, or the government's authority to direct users and citizens to provide information as and when required. But at the same time, in practice, what is really happening is we have all these applications and service providers. So if I can talk about WhatsApp and such others who provide now end-to-end encryption. And I have not yet seen any reaction from the government yet. But going by the past experiences, for example, in 2010, the BlackBerry issue had become a very prominent issue worldwide, where the Indian government had forced BlackBerry to put servers in India so that the government could have access to information that they wanted under the powers that they had to intercept. So this is the kind of canvas that we have. So any specific questions related to our proposed national encryption policy last year, or why it was trashed by the public or the stakeholders, and anything else to do with the service provision in terms of encryption, I would be happy to answer. But the last point I would like to make is that in India, for many years, the central government has also been trying to establish a central monitoring system where the objective is to kind of upgrade and sync the activities of at least 15 or 20 law enforcement agencies or intelligence agencies who work separately at this point of time, but to kind of synchronize their working, they are trying to set up a centralized monitoring system, which has also been kind of subjected to criticism by the civil society, saying that it basically infringes upon the liberties of the people, and the government has taken undue powers upon itself to snoop whenever they want to. So these are the kind of things that go around in terms of encryption and snooping and interception or monitoring by the government in India. And I think pretty much the same kind of legislative landscape exists in the neighboring countries in South Asia around India.
Thank you, Amitabh.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for sharing what's happening in India. I mean, we really should pay attention. India has a huge population. It has a huge future as an internet population as well. So now, last but not least, I'm going to turn over to Amie.
Thank you, Christine, and thank you to David and for the Internet Society for having us out here to talk about this topic, and to all of the fellow speakers and everybody who's still paying attention. I want to start by saying that India and the UK aren't the only places where activity is happening. We are seeing, for example, in Kazakhstan, that the government is trying to mandate that individual users install backdoors on their own computers, on their own end devices. In China in December, we saw that the government passed a law that essentially not only banned end-to-end encryption, the strongest types of encryption that are available, but also placed a fine on companies that were to define that ban that has no maximum. There's no maximum amount that the government can fine against these companies that try to provide user security. Brazil recently imprisoned a vice president of Facebook because because WhatsApp, which Facebook owns, is unable to turn over consumer communications because those communications are end-to-end encrypted. And immediately after, in France, we saw that they actually put forward a provision in their law to allow them by law to do the same, to start imprisoning corporate executives if that company were to use strong encryption. And then in probably the most egregious case for a law on encryption that has probably been on the books the longest, but thankfully never actually imposed upon people, enforced. In Colombia, we've seen an outright ban on encryption. Encryption is not allowed to be used in Colombia, except because, you know, there has to be an except. There's a separate law that actually allows encryption for top-level government officials. So it really codifies this double standard for normal everyday people using the internet and for the government, which we think is probably one of the most harmful things that we can do. And unfortunately, where these conversations are going in far too many companies. So it's important to note here that we're only having this conversation because the internet was not built to be secure. And encryption is what helps us battle this default insecurity. And it's what has allowed us to use the internet since the internet was born, to communicate, to bank, to store our data, to watch porn, or to watch cat videos, depending on what you'd rather do. It's kind of what allows us to interact on the internet and do all of the things that we do. In the world of encryption policy, lawmakers like to say we need to find a balance between privacy and security on this issue. But I would present that that is actually the wrong framing, because when they say balance, what you actually should hear, and what far too often is meant, is that it's a zero-sum game. People need to give up a little bit of privacy in order to be secure. And the problem with this is encryption actually protects both privacy and security. And we think it is absolutely essential. It's necessary in a world where everything is really digital. Unlike other topics that we tend to fight about, this is simply not something that we can compromise on. There are other more productive conversations that we should actually be having in law and policy, talking about, for example, what circumstances, if there are circumstances, when government should be able to hack into computers or networks, or how to handle digital estates after death. These are really productive conversations to be having. But fighting over how big of a backdoor to put on encryption, or whatever you want to call it if you don't like the phrase backdoor, or what government should have access to that backdoor, that's not productive. So this is why we actually launched at Access Now, securetheinternet.org. With the support of groups and experts from around the world. I think there are 40 different countries represented currently on that website, maybe a few more. So it has really broad support on 5 specific tenets that we think are central in order to protect the internet, both now and in the future. You can add your name to that site if you want to go to securetheinternet.org, or if you'd like to add your organization, you can contact me. The 5 tenets that we really built around, and we think that this is representative, addresses some of the policy conversations happening everywhere, are first, that government shouldn't be able to ban or limit user access to encryption, or prohibit the implementation or use of encryption by grade or type. That government should not mandate the design or implementation of vulnerabilities or so-called backdoors into any tool, technology, or service. The government should not require that tools, technologies, or services are designed or developed to allow for third-party access to unencrypted data or to encryption keys, the so-called key escrow, which just creates a huge attack surface for people to go into and gain access to a lot of communications at once. Fourth, that government should not seek to weaken or undermine encryption standards or intentionally influence the establishment of standards to promote a higher level, unless it's to promote a higher level of information security. And this is a conversation we are having frequently in the United States, where we have the NSA set up as both the agency to conduct surveillance as well as to break into surveillance, or to break into encryption. And so they're limiting the amount of encryption that they think should be on the market so they can continue their surveillance procedures. And finally, that government should not compel public or private, either through public or private agreement, any of those 4 tenets above. So not only should they not implement those into law, but they also shouldn't go to companies and kind of be like, hey, on the side, can you guys give us a backdoor? We're not going to make you do it, but we really kind of want you to do it anyway. And we don't think that should be happening either. So that's the kind of the high level of where we're coming from, and I'd be happy to take more questions.
Great, thank you very much, Amie, and thank you very much for sharing the security and internet principles, and sort of bring us back full circle to where Olaf started by talking about, what is the internet? Why are we talking about encryption today? So, looking at the time, I'm going to use moderator's prerogative and say that rather than go to the questions I had put together for our expert speakers, since we already received a number of the questions in advance and I see them coming through the chat, that we'll go straight to the questions that you have given us. But before I do that, I just want to check. There are two people who contacted me before the session, and I want to see if they're online. So Stephanie, you know who you are, and John, similarly, you know who you are. If you're online today, can you just let me know in the chat so I can call on you to ask your questions and make your statements. And otherwise, let me just turn to our list of questions. We actually have a bundle of questions that came in that you could possibly put under the category of trust in a technology. So I'm going to put the three questions together, and then I'm going to turn to our experts and ask who would like to cover which piece. So the first question we received via Facebook from Mohammed Mudabid, and he asks, I'm using proper encryption to protect my communications online, but I'm always paranoid. How could I trust encryption when we hear sometimes about secret government projects used to bypass unbreakable encryption? And then the second related question comes from Red Savina on Twitter. Is it safe enough to keep us from the Five Eyes type gang? And then a third question, a little bit more specifically technical but related, comes from Mohammed Batcat on Twitter. Is elliptic curve cryptography safe? No failure, no backdoor. So I'm going to turn to our panelists, and maybe I'll start with Amie first. Would you like to tackle some of these questions?
Sure, and I'll speak shortly on this and then turn over to some of my co-speakers because I think actually there's one way to answer all of this, and it's that encryption is not foolproof. It never will be. It is not going to keep the most sophisticated actors out of your communications. If you are a target for a very sophisticated actor, if they are going after you, encryption is probably not going to be the panacea for you. However, what encryption does do is A, it is your best first line of defense against people who are trying to look at your communications. And B, it actually is going to really help with that bulk collection that we're seeing a lot of countries talk about. It's going to make it a little more expensive, a little harder to get access to your communications. And so that's really one of the reasons that we propose it so highly to people and try to recommend that they use it. It is not enough to keep safe from the Five Eyes governments, even though that those governments are often seen as the most sophisticated, well-funded, well-resourced entities. They're not the only ones that can cause a lot of harm to systems. And so the problem is that in a lot of governments around the world discussing backdoors or how to build in vulnerabilities or mandate vulnerabilities for encryption, none of them are discussing the same thing. And so companies are really trying to figure out how to build in a bunch of holes into products. And the smaller companies, the startups, the ones that are really funding competition in industry, aren't going to be able to afford to build a separate product for each country that is asking for it. And so they're going to actually end up with the weakest products. And so it not only undermines security across the internet in all products, but it really harms competition by making those smaller companies unable to keep up on the topic of security. And so every single country that is implementing mandates on this issue is a threat to the global internet because the internet doesn't know borders.
Thank you very much, Amie. I'm now going to turn to Olaf. Olaf, would you like to address these questions?
Yeah, well, there's very little to add to what Amie said. Amie spoke really about the implementations and the arm races around the implementations. I think the only thing to add here is that fundamentally, if you look at the cryptographic primitives, the math underneath, there is in the academic world a constant reassessment of the costs and the risks of breaking the cryptography. It's always an economic type of assessment. How long does it take with the current knowledge of the cryptography, of the algorithms, with the computer power that we have to break keys? For elliptic curve cryptography, to be a little bit more specific to one of the questions, that's a class of mathematical problems that are at the basis, and by choosing the right parameters, you may have strong crypto. By choosing the wrong parameters, you probably have weak crypto. And understanding which parameters you pick is a work of art, which specialists are looking at, and whether you can trust the specialists is sometimes a matter of debate and question. So yes to all of the above, but even on the most fundamental problem, even the most fundamental aspects are of, I would say, economic nature, investment in study, and of the protection and investment in the study of the of how to break these things.
Thank you, Olaf. Since we have you on the mic, and I'm going to ask you a question that Adam has sent in. He says that you mentioned the possibility of law enforcement and intelligence agencies making use of implementation flaws in their investigations. This implies a collection and hoarding of exploits of consumer devices and applications, and actively avoiding or even preventing responsible disclosure of encryption flaws. How do you address the fact that these exploits effectively have the same properties as an escrowed key, including potential interception and use by unauthorized parties? A tricky question. Over to you, Olaf.
Joy. Yeah, I think this is a difficult one. For me, I would say follow a two-track principle. The existence of vulnerabilities in systems or software is, I would say, even a public safety measure for all of us. And I would urge public-private partnerships for responsible disclosure of any bugs that are found. That is not the case that even in the face of those, it is not the case that even in the face of those disclosures, systems might not be patched. Sometimes people just forget to upgrade their software. It might be the case that users use foolish mechanisms to do their work, or the criminals in this case. And I believe that it is the case that not all entrance hacking by government agencies under subpoena, of course, under lawful hacking by law enforcement, makes use of the most advanced vulnerabilities. They not always use zero-day vulnerabilities, but often make use of technologies that are well known and to a broad base and broad communities, including the evil people, the hackers. So I think that the approach, principled, should be yes, if there are vulnerabilities out there, it's okay for law enforcement to use this as backdoors. At the same time, governments should drive those public partnerships in disclosure. So while you still have the buck in your back pocket, you also bring it back to the private sector, so you solve this problem. That's sort of where I personally land. I wouldn't say this is an ISOC position yet, but this is where I personally land with that audience, with that balance.
Thank you, Olaf, for tackling a very difficult question there. I wonder if, Kimmo, whether you would be interested in sharing a few words about this question. And at the same time, I'll ask, is there anyone else on the call who would consider themselves coming from the law enforcement community? Just let me know in the chat. Kimmo, do you want to say a few words?
Sure, yeah. There has been lots of discussion about encryptions and the governments and how to protect citizens for the government actions. But of course, well, I'm working for the government. I'm now in international organization. I see it in other ways. So how to protect citizens from criminals and especially cyber criminals. But the fact is that without having a possibility to decrypt data, law enforcement often they don't have anything to continue the investigation. So I think it's important to have discussion with industry, like Olaf mentioned earlier, public-private partnership, and having discussion with industry. He mentioned responsible disclosure of the information, but I see it in a different way. If we could discuss with industry to having a way for responsible decryption of the information, because at the moment the situation is with law enforcement. If law enforcement has a vulnerability in their hands and they have to use that vulnerability for the investigation, they have a conflict of interest to provide that vulnerability back to industry, or they can use the information for their further investigations. But at the same time, of course, criminals, they can use exactly the same kind of vulnerability. So instead of that, I think we should work together with the industry and of course with the civil society to find ways to have better ways for the responsible decryption of the data.
Thank you, Kimmo. I think Courtney is going to want to tackle this question as well. But when she speaks, I'm also going to ask her one of the many questions that Cloud has been putting in the chat room. And so I'll just say it now. I'm paraphrasing here. So he's saying anonymity is not always good. Is there a balance? Does encryption and anonymity walk hand in hand? So over to you, Courtney.
Sure. Just on the issue of the law enforcement issue, I think that it's important to remember this discussion we're having right now is fundamentally about the internet and trust. And the fact is that the mass surveillance and the overreaches by democratic governments that supposedly have accountability mechanisms in place is one of the reasons that there is a lack of trust in their need, and what they're saying about, their needs for access to data. I think that it's important on law enforcement and national security side to rebuild that trust, because I think that many people are willing in limited situations, to want to provide that access. But when it's felt that that access was taken for so many years and backdoors and, these technologies, working with the companies to put backdoors into both the hardware and the pipes, running the internet and telecommunications infrastructure, there's just no trust. And so that's, another critical part of this debate. But moving on to the question around anonymity. Absolutely, anonymity, I think what you're talking about, anonymity in terms of communication online, is a double-edged sword. We actually covered this in our report. We published a book called Attacks on the Press, and there are several chapters, including one I wrote, that are about, internet trolling, harassment of women, gender minority journalists, and how that also has offline security implications. But the fact is that anonymity is part of the mix that enables people to freely express themselves and to receive information. And we can see this, for example, in Vietnam, where the ability to blog, to express oneself anonymously is really important, because those who don't use anonymity have been put in jail. There are many, many bloggers in Vietnam who are in jail because they express their opinion. So being able to communicate anonymously is important. Similarly, I think very few of us would be open to the idea of having to provide our identity card, for example, or some proof of identification in order to go, say, use an internet connection in a public library. What if you're researching, what if you're part of the investigative journalism network that was researching this massive corruption, revelations related to the Panama Papers? You want to be able to do that research anonymously, to communicate anonymously. That's very important. You don't want to have to register in order to use internet access, or necessarily register in order to get access to a mobile phone. So there are actually many dynamics and kind of many different points along the way when anonymity is important. And of course, I recognize that it's a double-edged sword, and I'm happy to put up some of the links to the stuff that I just mentioned in the chat.
Thank you very much, Courtney. It's really useful to tease out the different issues between encryption and anonymity. I'm now going to turn to another question that we received via Twitter from Ian Clark. And this one I'm going to start with Amitabh. So let me just check the question. So the question is, it's sort of a digital divide question. It's asking about the difficulty in ensuring encryption technology is accessible to all. So over to you, Amitabh.
Thank you. I think let me start by talking about the challenges that countries like India have in terms of bridging the digital divide. Obviously, with a population of 1.3 billion, just about 23% or 24% of the people just about connected to the internet. We have a huge task in front of us to connect as many people as we can and as quickly as we can to the internet. So that's the whole issue about the digital divide. There's also a subtext to that when we talk about 460 million people already online, most of them are using mobile internet. And the broadband penetration is still much lower, which is probably in the range of 12 to 13% or 15% maximum. So this is the kind of challenge, and considering the fact that India is very high in terms of the global perception of being an IT, enabled country, with so many people still not connected, it's a huge challenge to be called a digital country where there's a lot of booming economy in terms of e-commerce happening, but then with less number of people on the internet, it limits us in that sense. So there are a lot of programs and plans which the government and the industry is engaged in terms of bridging that digital divide. Lots of programs have been rolled out in terms of how fast we can connect those many people, especially because a large part of India stays in villages, in difficult terrains, where taking a network and penetrating internet is a huge, huge task. And it's also a matter of economic limitations in terms of investments that are required to take the network and put people online. So that's one side of the story. When it comes to encryption and trust and privacy, I think the people, majority of the internet users of the country are pretty much sensitive to the fact that the internet needs to be trusted. And in that sense, they do depend upon the service providers because it's a regulated industry here. As I mentioned earlier, laws are there to provide for responsible intervention or interception by the government agencies. So the extent to which in the Western or the Northern American hemisphere of Europe, the trust in government being able to hack into their own citizens' data has snowballed. In India, it hasn't really reached that point of that flashpoint yet, because I think mostly by and large, people do tend to trust the internet as of now. And I think the private sector players do tend to ensure that the customers or the users that they address already are made aware of the kind of trust levels or the kind of technologies that they use in terms of keeping that trust alive to a lot of extent. So that's the second dimension. The third dimension is about the government's role and the intelligence agencies and the LEA's role. And I said there are laws which are very clearly specified in terms of how much the government and the methods and procedures by which the government agencies can actually hack into the systems lawfully to investigate crime. So to that extent, we have, okay, let me also come to the point of how the court systems work here. Now, what happens is that we do not have secret courts who will collaborate with the intelligence agencies covertly and pass laws and orders, allowing agencies to illegally hack into somebody's system. Because what happens is that the open courts here that we have are very clear in terms of what kind of evidence that the agencies can bring in to implicate the bad actors. So even if the law enforcement agencies have to use evidence that they collect, it has to be legally validated and acceptable document in the code of law. So to that extent, I think we have a set of laws which protects us, and this legal system that protects us from large-scale illegal snooping. And this does not include, what we have in terms of issues about abusive behavior and everything else. So that's one part. The other part is that, as I mentioned, I think we still do not have a national level policy. That is something that we are grappling with. The government is yet to come out with a revised encryption policy, which will basically take into account the, the global norms as to where encryption has reached. I think we still have to evolve to the extent of understanding the technology, to the extent that it has evolved, the extent to which the private players and the government can use those technologies, and also at the same time provide for a balance between the use of technology to protect people online, create that trust, and also ensure privacy. But at the same time, allow the LEAs to do their job in terms of securing the lives of the online users. So that's the perspective that I have, and I hope it makes sense to the person who put the question out. Happy to provide any more clarifications on that.
Thank you, Amitabh. Certainly, I think it's an important area that often isn't talked about, is the availability of encryption for all people in the world, not just rich countries or those with access to easy technology. I'm going to turn to Olaf for a related question, and there may be others who would like to address this. So a question came in. The question is that there is a fear that encryption is not being sufficiently widespread. So the question is, what can really be done to make it widespread? And this came from Blake on Twitter. Over to you, Olaf.
What can be done to make it widespread? I think that end users can do a little. Being aware of making sure that when you connect to your bank that you use it over HTTPS, that the tools that you use, that they support HTTPS, that if you're a little bit more technical and you run an operation, you support tools like DNSSEC, which on the long term will allow you to do the authentication of a connection well, so that you have a second source of truth for that authentication, which will increase your security. But I think what the most important driver is usability of the software, usability of the tools that are used to set up secure services, and so on and so forth. I've seen Richard Barnes on the call, who is one of the protagonists around a tool called Let's Encrypt, which is a free certificate signing with a certificate signing authority that comes with a lot of tooling that allows server operators that set up services to almost automatically create certificates so that they can make their websites more secure. So it's that type of usability and tooling that I believe will increase the amount of encryption. I think that answers the question. Now I have a question for Kimmo, based on the discussion that we just had. Kimmo argued for good reason. Can we figure out a way to do responsible decryption of information in a responsible way, with oversight for law enforcement? And I'm actually curious in that question too. Can we do that? Now, by looking at technical arguments, by looking at academic arguments, most people will claim that is virtually impossible. So my question to Kimmo is, supposing that every right mind is putting their minds to it, I think, you know, this is a laudable thing to put your mind to. But supposing we collectively do that, and we still do not find a good solution, what then? What would be the effect of that? Would that mean, for instance, strong laws that will prevent encryption, or something else? What do you think is the effect? Or is it the case that we, just to sort of inject an answer and test it, or is it the case that we continue to use encryption because it's important for, as argued, security of journalists, security of people in their normal conversation. It's critical to e-commerce, and it does mean that as a cost, we will not be able to catch criminals who use encryption as a tool for their own communication, but also as a tool for the crimes.
Yes.
That was a long one, wasn't
it? Yeah. Thank you very much for the question. And responsible disclosure, I think it is a challenge for law enforcement in general, and challenge also for the governments. And also the question about what governments are going to do with that if we don't find a good way to do that securely and responsibly. I think Amie and Courtney, they already partially answered that question, and they had a couple of examples of governments taking actions. And I think we're going to see this happening also in the future. So governments, if they don't have ways to discuss with industry for the I would say responsible way for the disclosure, then we will see demands to change legislation. And also in some ways also the governments might try to find other ways to make industry to work with them, not even through the legislation, but changing the internal regulations. What it means for the law enforcement, it means that we have to find alternative methods for the investigation. And that means that it will take more time for the investigation to investigate cases. And that, then again, I think I should also mention there was earlier a question about difference between intelligence agencies and law enforcement agencies. And then, of course, I understand that in some countries they're quite close to each other. Some countries law enforcement organizations are completely separate. So there's a big difference. And there's also a difference between the needs in law enforcement and intelligence agencies. So in a nutshell, I think what is going to happen if we don't find ways for responsible disclosure, we will see governments trying to change their legislation, trying to find ways to force industry to provide solutions for the law enforcement and then intelligence agencies.
Thank you, Olaf and Kimmo. That's really a fascinating an issue. I think we were earlier related. What I'm going to do is moderator's prerogative again, and Amie and Courtney wanted to add to the issue about encryption being widespread. But before I turn over to them, we also received a question which talks about the recent Europol and ENISA statement that came out this week, that they came forth with a strong pro-encryption stance, arguing that curbing or otherwise undermining encryption is a greater risk than benefit. The question is, this seems to be a clear statement from EU law enforcement and security interests, something that we haven't seen from those stakeholders in other countries. The question then is the technical consensus that strongly secured communications by default should be standard, spreading to other stakeholders? And said differently, has anything changed in the positions of stakeholders? So Kimmo, I don't know if you want to answer this question before I hand over to Courtney and Amie.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think I can answer maybe later, after Courtney and Amie, if that's okay.
Certainly. I'm going to hand over to Courtney.
Sure. So two things. I mean, I can address that question because I think you've seen in the United States several high-level intelligence officials as well as political leaders acknowledge the fact that encryption is important and that more important to make sure that it's secure. So it's good to see the EU getting on board with that as well. I think there's a broad recognition that when we're talking about encryption in these debates, we're often talking about a very specific type of encryption without realizing that it's actually what enables us to even use the internet for everything that we use it for. But going back to this issue of how do you make, I think what we're talking about is how do you make end-to-end encryption more easy for users to implement in their communications, right? I think that's kind of the question that was being asked. One way to do that is to integrate it into the communications platforms, into the email servers, etc. So it is very easy to use. If you have to get training on how to use something, it's probably going to limit adoption. And of course, as we mentioned, people like the bloggers in Ethiopia. So one thing is integrating it and making it default. Another thing is people, and I would include journalists, the journalistic community, this idea that, oh, I have nothing to hide and therefore I don't need to use encryption is very problematic and yet still prevalent. And I think that we need to shift that attitude, because the more people that use encryption in their communications, the safer everyone will be. Because also, let's remember, in order to use encryption and make it worthwhile, it really needs to be among all of the people who are trying to communicate with each other, right? If you're sending an encrypted message to somebody who doesn't know how to decrypt it or isn't using the same system, it communication. So the more people that use encryption, the better, because that means it's more likely that the communications will be secured. And then also that cuts down on the ability of governments to identify problematic, what they would consider problematic users, by saying who's using encryption. There were reports a few years ago about Pakistan, targeting people who were using encryption because that was somehow some sort of indication that they were an activist or, opposition, etc. So I think that's, it's really important that everyone make an effort, especially those in professions like journalism or activism or the medical profession or other professions that depend upon secure communications, should adopt those and set the example, even if you personally feel that you don't need to communicate securely.
Thank you very much, Courtney. Handing over to Amie now.
Sure, and I think some of what I wanted to say has been said. I just think it's important to add, how to implement encryption into products and services is really an interesting business decision. And so you get each side. You have the law enforcement complaining that they're going dark, especially in the US, that everything will be encrypted. And then on one side, you're having people saying, I can't even use secure encryption services because nobody else is using them. And a lot of different companies have started looking at both problems and have taken really interesting approaches. So you have Signal and WhatsApp that are encrypting by default. We think, just like Courtney said, that default is incredibly critical to making sure that people are able to use the strongest types of encryption. And you can see that with the debate versus the iPhone and the Android, where the iPhone, the hard drive is encrypted by default now, and Android devices are not. And so the number of Android devices that end up encrypted are quite small. And so Android devices actually end up as a target for device theft more often, because it's more, they're more usable if they get a hold of, whereas an iPhone might be bricked because nobody can get into it. And so that default is really important. But then you saw with Allo, which is the new Google chat service that was released, this choice between, or is it going to be end-to-end encrypted? A user can turn that on, and it seems like it's going to be kind of simple to do that, but it's not the default. And is there an actual business purpose for not doing it the default, and what does that mean? And these are really difficult questions that companies are asking themselves. But when you look at governments getting involved in mandating that companies build products certain ways, when they're already struggling with these questions and how to provide the best security for their users, that is not a way to provide security. That's kind of the antithesis of security, are these mandates that are requiring things to be built in a certain way. And the other thing to keep in mind is that the mandates are not going to stop the bad guys that kind of have come up in this conversation over and over again from having access to encryption that prevents law enforcement or intelligence agencies from gaining access to their information. There are always going to be countries where companies can exist and build and deploy and implement very strong encryption technologies outside of the realm of these mandates. People are always going to be able to build them for themselves. We've seen this happen. And then you're going to have the free and open source software where if there's a backdoor or any sort of vulnerability built in, it's going to be noticed because people can look at the code and people can build around it or build on top of it and bypass that. So we're not, with these mandates, we're making the defaults less secure. We're making 99% of the people who are doing nothing wrong, who are just trying to protect their bank account number from somebody who's trying to access it, from being able to secure that properly. But we're not actually getting at what law enforcement is identifying as the problem, which is these bad guys' communication. And how do you get to that? Because they're always going to find a way to get past the mandates.
Great, thank you very much, Amie. I'm looking at the time, everyone, and our time is almost up. So I'm giving our expert speakers a warning that I'm going to be calling on them to sum up what they want to say today in no more than a tweet. So you've got a couple of minutes to think about that while I just cover some administrative and thank you things. So first of all, let me start by saying thank you everyone for joining this discussion. It's been really very fruitful. We've covered a lot of important topics. I wish we had more time to go into these in more depth. And there is a way we can do this. I would encourage everyone to continue the discussion on Twitter. We have a hashtag, and I'm going to ask my colleague Dan to post it in the chat again so that we can use that. So please feel free to continue asking your questions, responding. It's really been, there it is, #InternetTrust. Please continue the discussions there. Also, I want to say thank you to David for his initiative in bringing us all together. Thank you to our DC chapter. And one last thing before I hand over to our experts to sort of say their last words in only a tweet. Just to let everybody know that the Internet Society has been working on a policy brief about encryption, and you should see that coming out in a little while. Okay, so I'm going to hand over first to Olaf.
Help! Help! I don't have my tweet ready yet. No, I think what I heard is encryption is fundamental for internet security, for personal security of people that use the internet. On the other hand, security is sometimes also something that is a way in protecting the personal security of people who use the internet or that walk away in their walks of life. So I think that we identified an incredibly important tussle, for which I don't think that there are scalable solutions for that responsible decryption that is needed. And now I know that this is almost a Facebook post. So I would say #encryption tussle and leave it at that.
Yes, thank you, Olaf. I think Twitter would have rejected that tweet, but it was still very valuable as a Facebook post. Turning to Kimmo now.
Well, I'm not very good with Twitter in general. So, well, my point is really to work together with law enforcement, have discussions like this with law enforcement, with industry, with academia, with civil society. More this kind of discussions, understand challenges and needs and difficulties on all sides. Well, for Twitter, I would just take a photo of this and post it in Twitter. So that's it.
Lovely. I like photos. Over to you, Courtney.
I would say that building trust and secure communications online requires not just tools, but also a change in behavior so that there is trust built by those with the power to surveil. And when they actually need access, that the public is willing to give those, and that no policies are happening in a vacuum. They have implications for people around the world, including those living in very repressive and closed societies. So let's remember that in these debates.
Great, thank you, Courtney. Amitabh?
Okay, I think it is important for countries like India to work on building trust online in the internet, so that it is one way of bringing more and more people on the net. And this is one task that we can accomplish if we have better encryption policies than we currently have.
Great, and finally, Amie?
Sure, exactly 140 characters. I'll even post it. Thanks, ISOC. Govs must protect and support encryption. It's vital to users in the future of the internet. #CryptoRules, www.securetheinternet.org. Thank you.
Okay, so Amie wins the Twitter challenge. Congratulations. But to be fair to Olaf, she also went last, so she had more time. Okay, so we have 3 minutes before we need to close the call. I'd just like to hand over to David to say his last final remarks and say thank you again, everyone. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you for your great moderation.
Yes, thank you,
Christine.
Thank you, Christine, and thanks to everybody who participated. This was really a wonderful panel. And
I'd love, to be honest, I'd love to see feedback from people on this. If there is something, I'm sure that we have you can reply to one of the tweets or send mail to us.
Yes, I'd love to see feedback as well. And I just want to say thank you all once again. This is exactly the type of conversation that helps to advance people working together to find solutions. Thanks.
Okay, and with that, I will say to Dan, who's been running all the communications and making the magic happen, I'll ask him to close the call. But thank you, everyone, for joining us today. It's been really a productive discussion, and I look forward to continuing it with you. Okay, bye, everyone.